Hey everyone, and thank you so much for clicking on this video. My name is Justin, and I apologize for the delay. I was away for the weekend. I just got back, but there was a ton of news, not only in Leafs land, but also around the entire NHL. Lots of deals heading into expansion draft protection list day, which I think a lot of people expected, but it was quite quiet until the very last minute when a lot of deals went down, Ryan Ellis included. You can see above me here, there's a hockey stick, the one above the Leafs one. That is Ryan Ellis's stick from when he played for Team Canada in the World Juniors. So I've been a fan of his play for a long time. He was an important part of that winning team in Team Canada in the World Juniors way back in the day. And to see him get moved, Nolan Patrick, lots of moving pieces. It was really cool to see because, I mean, it's been quite quiet ever since the Stanley Cup Finals. And then, of course, the Toronto Maple Leafs had some news in acquiring Jared McCann. I've always been a fan of watching the Pittsburgh Penguins whenever the Leafs aren't on, and for a long time the Leafs never made the playoffs, and so the Pittsburgh Penguins were my favorite team to watch in the playoffs. And in recent years, in watching them, I've always admired the play of Jared McCann, and I think that he is the player that I've been mentioning for the Leafs for a long time. One of those players that doesn't make a lot of money, doesn't get all the fame, is going to be very quiet in terms of playing behind the likes of, Gensel, Malkin, Crosby, Rust. He's not one of those big names on the team, but he's a very effective player. And I know his stats last year were much more inflated than probably his average stats for a season, but he's a very solid piece and doesn't make a lot of money. I think that's the kind of mentality and that's the kind of player that we need to have on the Leafs outside of the likes of the Matthews, Tavares, Nylander, Marner. You need those players that are on a cheaper deal that don't really get all the attention, but are still very serviceable and great depth pieces. And I don't think that there's any way that anybody can say that this was a bad move. I think it's fantastic. I keep going on about how I think Kyle Dubas does all the right things. This is, again, another one of those moves that Kyle Dubas is just big braining the rest of the league, and I'll explain a little bit more now. It's been reported for a long time that Alex Kerfoot was likely the player that was going to be taken in the expansion draft to Seattle. If you're not familiar with that process, you have an option of either protecting 7 forwards, 3D, and a goaltender, which wasn't in the Leafs game plan because they wanted 4D to protect and they didn't really have 7 forwards that they needed to protect. And so the other option was 8 players and a goaltender, which the Leafs ultimately opted to do, taking 4 forwards and 4 defensemen. And so with that strategy, of course, Alex Kerfoot is left exposed, and Jared McCann was likely the player that was going to be taken by Seattle in Pittsburgh. And so Pittsburgh's mentality here was just get rid of the player for some assets in return instead of just losing him for nothing. And in exchange, the Leafs get either the perfect replacement for Alex Kerfoot if Seattle ultimately takes him. He's a great third-line center, can play that role very well, was more productive, and costs about $500,000 less than Kerfoot, not to mention the fact that he can play on the wing and has better goal-scoring numbers. Or ultimately, they decide they want to take Jared McCann, and Alex Kerfoot is someone that a lot of people were upset with the Leafs possibly losing for absolutely nothing, especially coming out of a playoff series where, although the Leafs yet again did not make it out of the first round, Kerfoot was one of the bright spots. I mean, the big guys were taking a lot of that hate, but Kerfoot played, I thought, really, really well and effectively, especially ever since Tavares went down and he was bumped up into a higher role. So a lot of people were upset with the prospect of him getting lost for nothing to Seattle. And so ultimately, if Seattle takes Jared McCann, we spent a 7th round pick and Philip Hollander, who we got from Pittsburgh in the Kasperi-Kapanen trade, in exchange for keeping Alex Kerfoot, essentially, where if we were to make that deal with Seattle, to make a deal and say, hey, we don't want you to take Alex Kerfoot, let's make you take this player instead, the report was that was going to cost about a 1st-round draft pick, maybe 2, or with an additional 3rd-round draft pick. A much, much, much higher price than what we paid to Pittsburgh. So the optics of this doesn't look great for the average fan that might not really understand how the NHL works and all the decision-making behind the scenes that goes into a deal like this. And I can understand that, and a lot of people have expressed hate on the optics. But if I'm Kyle Dubas, I don't care about that. I mean, ultimately, when the season starts and we start playing and we have one of either Jared McCann or Alex Kerfoot on the team, people won't really care about what happened in the expansion draft. They'll be just concentrated on how well the team is doing and how well that player is doing on this team. Of course, if Alex Kerfoot doesn't get selected and they take Jared McCann, likely we make a deal, but the optics of it still look better at that point where we get some assets in return for Alex Kerfoot. Yes, some people might not understand, again, the idea of going up for a player that we ultimately just lose right away. But again, management should have no concern about that. They do what's best for the team, no matter how it looks for the general public. And again, those diehard fans do understand the idea of spending much less to get a Jared McCann and losing him to Seattle versus spending a little bit more, or a lot more, I should say, to Seattle for selecting a specific player. In my opinion, I do hope that Seattle does ultimately take Alex Kerfoot. I do think that, yes, you can get a little bit more for him in return if you were to explore the trade market, but I don't think Alex Kerfoot is someone that is going to demand a lot of assets back in the trade market right now. A lot of teams are very cash strapped, and yes, Alex Kerfoot could be worth $3.5 million, but how many teams want to take that contract? What would they spend for it? Would it just be a couple picks? I'd rather just get him off the books, lose the $3.5 million, don't take any assets back, and that includes don't take any contracts back. And instead, you've got Jared McCann, who I think is a tremendous acquisition for this team. No, he's not the gritty big player that a lot of people want, but he is one of those very serviceable players that if you were to put him on the first line with Matthews and Marner, at only $3 million, you can afford to do that. You've got the cap space to work with for that, and he's going to provide a lot of scoring depth on that first line, as well as if you put him as a third line center, he's very serviceable in that role, and again, can drive a line on his own. He never played with Crosby or Malkin on Pittsburgh. He's able to drive the offense on his own, and so in a third line role, I think he would excel on the Toronto Maple Leafs. In other news, and this has long been reported, it was, I think, the middle of last week that this came out, but yes, a lot of people are still hot on the idea of Gabriel Landeskog potentially coming home to Toronto. I don't think that's happening, and to be honest, I don't really want that to happen unless the Leafs were to move out one of their top 4 contracts, which they're adamant on not wanting to do. You can't bring in a player at $7+ million on the forward group at this point when you're already spending $40 million on 4 forwards. You just can't have $47 million on 5 players. Of course, Landeskog fits everything and more of what the Toronto Maple Leafs are looking for in this offseason and have lacked in seasons past, but you just can't keep spending that high budget. You need to find those low, very good value players. If Gabriel Landeskog were willing to take something in the nature of $5 or $6 million, I'd be way more willing to discuss, but $7+ million, which is what he's reportedly looking for on the free agent market, closer to $10 million is actually the report. No way, no chance the Leafs are going to be spending that value on that player. A lot of people are curious as to why he's not close to a deal with the Colorado Avalanche right now. Well, I think the clear reason why is because Cale Makar, he's a restricted free agent and will probably be demanding somewhere in the range of $10 million on his own. And so does Colorado really have the money to spend then an additional $8 to $9 million on Gabe Landeskog as well as the $10 million from Cale Makar? I don't think so. That's not something that they really want to do. I do ultimately think that he re-signs in Colorado. I can't see him wanting to leave Colorado and taking a discount somewhere else, let's say the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's just not something that will typically happen and not something that I think we can expect to happen either. Yes, the Leafs will have a little bit more money from the likes of Zach Hyman and Frederik Andersen's contracts coming off the book, but not that much, and we're not allocating all of that to one player who, again, if we go down in the playoffs and he doesn't perform or he gets hurt, it's just not a recipe for success. So I like the reports. It's always fun in the offseason to consider possibilities and think of that fantasy hockey on what the Leafs can do for next season. But I think that's all this is. It's just chat. It's just an opportunity to fantasize about a potential lineup with Gabriel Landeskog in it, but it's ultimately not going to happen. And if it does, we'll have to see what kind of moves are subsequent to it because you're not adding him to the 4 players that are already at $40 million. So in all, again, the Jared McCann signing or trade was fantastic in my eyes. Hopefully he can re-sign with Toronto as well if he does end up staying and not getting selected by Seattle to a cheap contract for the future. I think he'll be a great piece for us, and I'm really excited to see him in a Leafs uniform if that ultimately should happen. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the other trades in the NHL? What are your thoughts on Gabe Landeskog coming home? I'd love to hear everything that you've got in mind. And for now, just thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you as we continue to get more news during this hectic week of Leafs hockey.